These are 3 true stories from people who realised, far too late, that someone had been watching them. If you have a story of your own, the email's in the description. Subscribe if you're new, and let's jump into story 1. She was lying in the bath when she saw it. The ceiling hatch, directly above her, had been moved. Not a lot, just enough. And in the gap between the hatch and the frame, there was darkness. But it wasn't empty darkness. It was the kind of darkness that had weight to it. The kind you feel looking back at you. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She lay in the water, naked, staring up at the gap. And for the first time in 6 months, every single thing that had confused her, the missing food, the doors, the puppy in the sink, the footsteps every single night above where she slept, collapsed into a single, paralysing thought. There is a person 3 feet above my head, and they can see me. Amber was 20 years old the spring she moved to Enumclaw. It's a farm in town at the foot of Mount Rainier in Washington State. The kind of place where you can hear cattle at dawn and the air smells of cut grass and wood smoke. She'd moved there to be near her brother and found a 1-bedroom apartment on the top floor of a small complex, 3 blocks from her family. Affordable rent, a bedroom with a window that rattled when the wind came down off the mountain. On her first night, lying in the dark, she heard them. Footsteps, not outside, not in the hallway, directly above her. Slow, measured, the pace of someone walking from one end of a room to the other. She looked up. The ceiling was low, cheap plasterboard, and in the far corner of her bedroom, there was a hatch, a square panel that pushed up into whatever space was above. She was on the top floor. There was nothing above her but the roof. The next morning she asked the building manager about it. He told her it was an attic crawl space, unfinished, sealed off, used for nothing. The footsteps? Raccoons, probably, maybe squirrels. Old buildings, you know, they make sounds. Amber believed him. She had no reason not to. She got a puppy, a tiny thing, barely bigger than her hand. She would come home from work, scoop the dog up and eat soup on the couch, fall asleep with the TV on. Life was quiet and small and good, but every single night, the footsteps came. It started with the food. She would buy a 6-pack of cola, drink 1, and come home the next evening to find 4 left. Not 2 missing, 1, as if someone was trying to take just enough that she'll doubt whether she miscounted. Tins of soup vanished, packets of noodles she was certain she bought simply weren't in the cupboard anymore. She assumed her brother was letting himself in. He had a spare key. She joked about it the next time she saw him. He stared at her. He hadn't been to her apartment in weeks. She let it go. Then the doors started changing position. She'll leave the bathroom door open, come home to find it closed, leave her bedroom door shut, come home to find it ajar. Never dramatically, never slammed or thrown, adjusted. The way you would move through someone's home if you were trying to leave everything almost exactly as it was. She told herself it was drafts. She told herself old frames warp. She told herself doors don't stay where you leave them. Then came the day she found the puppy in the sink. She left the dog in the bathroom. It was too young to be trusted alone in the flat. When she came home from work, the bathroom floor was flooded. A pipe had leaked, an inch of standing water covered the tiles, and the puppy, this tiny animal couldn't jump higher than a cushion, was sitting in the bathroom sink. Dry, placed there, not panicking, calm, as if someone had picked it up out of the water, gently set it in the basin and left. Someone had been inside her apartment while she was at work, and they had saved her dog's life. That detail is what stopped her from calling the police, because the act was kind, and kindness, she told herself, doesn't come from someone dangerous. Maybe it was the building manager checking on the pipe. Maybe it was a neighbour who heard the water. She pushed it down. She moved on. She went to sleep that night to the sounds of footsteps above her bed, the way she had every night for months. And here's the thing that I keep coming back to. The thing that makes this story so much worse than it first appears. She wasn't ignoring the signs because she was stupid. She was ignoring them because every single clue came wrapped in something that could be explained. One missing cola, a door slightly in a different position, a dog in the sink. Individually, none of this was enough. Together, it was a portrait of someone who knew her schedule, her habits, her home, intimately, and was careful enough never to leave a trace she couldn't rationalize away. That's not a stranger hiding, that's someone practicing. 6 months in, Amber woke up feeling ill and called in sick from all 3 of her jobs. She spent the day on the sofa. She didn't leave the building. This was the first time she'd broken her routine since moving in, and the person above her had no way of knowing. At 11 PM she turned off the lights, lit a single candle, and ran a bath. She lowered herself into the water and let the heat soften the knots in her shoulders. The apartment was silent. The building was silent. The road outside was silent. Then she looked up. The attic hatch was open, not all the way, just shifted, just enough to leave a gap, maybe 4 inches of black between the panel and the frame. And the air moving through that gap was warm, not cold like a draft from an empty attic. Warm, like breath. She described what happened next to the criminal podcast years later, and the thing she said that I have never been able to forget is this. Everything just slowed way down. What took about 10 seconds felt like 5 minutes. I just lay there in the water and I put it all together. The footsteps every night, directly above her bed. The food, 1 can, 1 packet, just enough to survive on. The doors, opened and closed by someone moving through her flat during the day. The puppy, lifted by human hands out of the water and placed somewhere safe. Someone had been living above her, descending into her flat while she was at work, eating her food, using her bathroom, moving through her rooms, and then climbing back up before she got home, every day, for 6 months. And at night, while she slept, they lay 3 feet above her face in the dark. She didn't scream. She told the podcast she didn't know why. Maybe because she understood, in a way that was animal, not rational, that if this person wanted to hurt her, they could have done it on any one of 180 nights while she slept beneath them. They hadn't. And that thought, that someone had been watching her sleep and choosing, night after night, not to act, was the most terrifying thought she'd ever had. She stood up slowly, water running off her body. She walked past the mirrored wardrobe in the hallway, a wardrobe she now suspected the person had hidden inside on the night she came home early. She put on a robe, walked to the kitchen, took a hammer out of the junk drawer, called her sister-in-law and whispered, "I think there's someone in my house." 3 minutes later, her sister-in-law pulled up with the engine running. The police searched the attic that night. They found it immediately. A sleeping bag, slept in recently. A small pile of food wrappers, tins, bottles, and a book. They never told Amber what the book was. She asked, but they wouldn't say. No fingerprints were recovered. No DNA matched anyone in the system. The case was classified, filed, and effectively abandoned within weeks. Amber moved out the next morning. She left behind most of what she owned. She eventually settled in Illinois, got married, had 2 children, and bought a house with no attic. But here's where this story turns into something I haven't been able to stop thinking about since I first read it. Years later, Amber recalled a detail she hadn't thought was significant at the time. A few weeks before the discovery, she was leaving her apartment when she noticed a man sitting at the bottom of the stairwell. Mid-30s, reddish hair, not doing anything, not talking to anyone, just sitting there. He looked at her, and he kept looking, not threatening, not aggressive, just fixed. The way someone looks at a person they already know, someone they've studied, someone whose face they watched from 3 feet away, in the dark, night after night after night. When she came back from the shops 30 minutes later, he was gone. She never saw him again. Police never identified him. But here's the part that Amber said still keeps her awake at night. 25 years later, she said, "I think he was the best roommate I ever had. He was quiet, he kept to himself, he always put the toilet seat down." She laughed when she said it, but she wasn't joking. She was describing a man who memorized her life so completely, her schedule, her habits, the position of every door and every object in her home, that he could live alongside her without leaving a single trace she couldn't explain away. The police told her the crawl space had no lock. It was accessible from the building's shared hallway. Anyone with access to the building could have climbed up any time. Amber's apartment complex still exists. It still rents to tenants, and the crawl space was never sealed. That was a stranger, someone who lived above a woman for 6 months and was never caught. The next story is worse, because the man who was crawling through the attic at 2 in the morning wasn't a stranger. He was a person she knew, the person who waved from the driveway, the person she had trusted for years, and what the camera caught him doing, directly above a sleeping baby, is something the family says they will never recover from. The footage is 11 seconds long, infrared, grainy, timestamped 2:17 AM. A man enters the frame from the left. He's not young, late 60s, moving slow, pulling himself along the wooden beams on his stomach with his elbows, the way a soldier crawls under wire. In his right hand, there is a cordless drill. He stops directly above a vent in the floor. Below that vent is a bedroom. In that bedroom, a man and his wife are asleep, 3 feet from their bed, in a crib. Their 10-month-old daughter is asleep. The man in the attic positions himself flat on his stomach, presses his face to the vent, and stays there for 30 minutes. The homeowner watched this footage on his phone the next morning, and then he watched it again, because the man on the screen, the 69-year-old man dragging a drill through his attic at 2 AM, was his next door neighbour. Jerome Kennedy and his wife had been living in their row house on the north side of Pittsburgh for long enough that it had stopped being a house and started being a home. The kind of place where you know which stair creaks, which radiator knocks, which window lets in a draft in December. Their daughter had been born the previous year and the nursery was on the 2nd floor, directly beside the master bedroom, close enough that they could hear her breathing through the wall at night. The houses on the street were terraced, connected, brick walls shared between properties, attics that ran the length of the room, separated by partitions that were decades old. Their next door neighbour was a retired man named Robert Havrilla, 69 years old, quiet, kept to himself. Jerome's wife would see him occasionally in the driveway and wave. He would nod back. Nothing memorable, nothing wrong, the kind of man you stop noticing. Jerome started hearing sounds at night. Not loud, not obvious, just a low scraping above the bedroom ceiling, usually between 1 and 3 a.m. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across wood. He assumed it was animals. Pittsburgh row houses are old, things get into the eaves. He made a note to call someone about it and went back to sleep, but the sounds kept coming, and they didn't sound like animals. They were too slow, too deliberate, too rhythmic. An animal scurries, an animal stops and starts. This was steady, patient, the sound of something or someone moving with purpose. Jerome went into the attic on a Saturday morning. He wasn't expecting to find anything, but what he found changed the way he sleeps. The dust on the attic beams had been disturbed, not scattered the way an animal would disturb it, cleared, in a line, a path, the width of a human body, running from the far end of the attic to the section of floor directly above his bedroom, and at the end of that path, above the spot where his daughter's crib sat below, he found small holes drilled through the mortar between the bricks, angled downwards, positioned that anyone lying flat on the beams above could see directly into the room below. She said he was overthinking it. He told a friend. His friend said it was probably from old wiring. Nobody believed him. So Jerome brought a camera, a small one, motion activated infrared. He mounted it on a beam, aimed it at the path through the dust, and left it running overnight. He didn't tell his wife. He didn't want to scare her if it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. He opened the footage the next morning at the kitchen table while his wife fed the baby in the next room. At 2:17 a.m, a figure appeared at the far edge of the frame. A man, old, moving slowly across the beams. He wasn't stumbling, he wasn't uncertain. He was distributing his weight carefully above each beam so the ceiling below wouldn't creak. His knees and elbows moved in precise rhythm. Left elbow, right knee, right elbow, left knee. The kind of movement you don't learn the first time, or the fifth. In his right hand, he carried a cordless drill. In his left, a small torch. He crawled to the spot above the bedroom, positioned himself flat on his stomach directly above the vent that opened into the ceiling below, and pressed his face to the gap and stayed there. Jerome watched the timestamp tick forward. 1 minute, 5, 10, 20, 30 minutes. The man didn't move, didn't shift. He lay motionless, face down, staring through the vent at Jerome's wife and infant daughter sleeping below. At 2:47, he reversed his crawl. Same pace, same care, same silence. He disappeared from the edge of the frame, back the way he came. Jerome paused the footage, rewound it to the frame where the man's face was partially visible in the infrared glow. It was Robert, his next door neighbour. The partition wall between their attics, the old brick divider that should have sealed one property from the next, had crumbled or been removed. There was a gap in the brickwork wide enough for a man to crawl through. Robert had been entering Jerome's attic from his own every night through a hole in the wall. Police arrested Robert and charged him with stalking and criminal trespass. Jerome and his wife sealed the gap in the brickwork with concrete. They installed bolts on the attic hatch. They put cameras in every room. But it was the forensics team's report that Jerome said destroyed something inside him. The drill holes weren't new. The wood around them had aged, darkened, settled. Some of them had been there for months, possibly longer. The forensic team couldn't say exactly how long, but they estimated that the oldest holes predated Jerome's daughter's birth, which means Robert had been watching Jerome and his wife from the attic before the baby was even born. He may have been there the night she came home from the hospital. He may have been lying 3 feet above her crib on her very first night in the world. And here is the detail from this case that no one ever reported and that Jerome mentioned only once in a local TV interview that was later pulled at his request. When officers arrived at Robert's home to arrest him, they asked to see a side of the attic. He refused. They obtained a warrant. When they entered, they found the gap in the brickwork, and beside it, on Robert's side, a wooden plank that had been used to bridge the beam so he could crawl silently. On that plank, scratched into the wood in small, deliberate letters, were 2 words. Jerome has never publicly said what those 2 words were. He's been asked. He won't answer. The police report redacted them. The only thing Jerome has ever said about it was this: "I asked the officer what was written on the board. He told me. I asked him please never to tell my wife." The family sold the house within the month. The listing didn't mention the attic. Jerome stated that he still checks the ceilings in every room of his new home, every night, not because he thinks someone is there, because he knows that Robert lived 6 feet from his family for years, waving from the driveway, nodding hello, and that nobody, not once, had any reason to suspect a thing, and that's the part that won't let him sleep. 2 stories about people hiding above other people's lives. One was a stranger, one was a neighbour. Both were found. This last story is different because the person behind the false wall in the attic was never found, and what they left behind suggests they weren't hiding at all. They were collecting. The estate agent called it a character property, Victorian mid-terrace, 2-bedroom, previous owner deceased in the home. What she didn't mention was where in the home he died, or that the attic contained a room that wasn't on any floor plan, or that the inside of that room, nailed to the underside of the rafters in rows so neat they looked like an exhibit, were 231 photographs, every single one taken at night through the windows of the house below, of the people who lived in it. The new owner's name was already scratched into the wall. She'd been there less than a week. Nadia was 32 and cautiously proud of herself the day she picked up the keys. A Victorian mid-terrace on a quiet street in a small town outside of Leeds. It needed everything. The wallpaper was blistered. The carpet smelled like decades of damp. The kitchen window had been painted shut so many times it no longer functioned as a window. But it was hers. First home, keys in hand, nobody else's name on the mortgage. The estate agent had been upfront about one thing: the previous owner, an elderly man who had lived alone for over 30 years, had died in the property. Natural causes, nothing violent. She said it quickly and moved on to the boiler. The attic was accessed through a hatch on the landing, a square panel with a brass ring pull, painted over so many times the edges were sealed with layers of gloss. The agent said the attic was boarded but not insulated, storage space. The previous owner had used it. She said those 2 words and then showed Nadia the garden. Nadia moved in on a Friday evening. By Sunday night she unpacked everything to feel like a person who lived there rather than a person visiting. She went to bed early, pulled the duvet up and read a book by lamplight. At 11:14 p.m, she remembered the time because she checked her phone. She heard a single knock from above, sharp, clean, like a knuckle on wood, then nothing. She told herself what every person tells themselves when they hear a sound in a house they don't know yet: pipes, beams contracting, the bones of an old building settling after the heating goes off. She went to sleep. The next night, at roughly the same time, she heard something different. Not a knock, a low vibration, deeper, resonant, like something heavy being dragged slowly across the boards above her. It lasted 4 or 5 seconds and stopped. She lay very still and listened. Nothing more. On the third night, she heard breathing. Not her own, it was coming from above. Slow, steady, the kind of rhythm you hear from someone who is asleep or from someone who is awake and lying very still. She got out of bed, stood on the landing, and looked up at the attic hatch. The paint around the edges were cracked, not fresh cracks, but not ancient either. She reached up and pulled the brass ring. The hatch didn't move. Years of paint have held it in place. She'd need tools. She told herself she'll deal with it over the weekend. During the week, she noticed other things. A cold spot on the landing that appeared after 10 p.m. and disappeared by morning, localized to the square meter directly beneath the hatch. Small flakes of paint on the landing carpet that hadn't been there when she hoovered, and a smell she couldn't place. Not decay, not damp, but something stale and human. The kind of smell a room has when it's been occupied but not opened. She called her friend Liam on a Saturday morning and asked him to bring a stepladder and a torch. He arrived at 10 with both, plus a crowbar and a joke about finding buried treasure. He climbed the ladder, worked the hatch loose with a crowbar, pushed the panel up and slid it aside, hoisted himself into the dark, switched on the torch, and said nothing for a very long time. Nadia heard him take 2 steps on the boards above him, then stop. Then she heard him say her name, quietly. The way you say someone's name when you want them to come closer but you're not sure you want them to see what you found. She climbed up after him. The attic was larger than she expected. Boarded floor, exposed rafters, a bare bulb that hadn't worked in years, boxes of old newspapers stacked along one wall, dust, cobwebs, all normal, except for the far end. Where the roof slope met the floor, there was a section of wall that shouldn't have existed. The house ended there. The terrace wall was on the other side. But someone had built a false partition across the space. The plaster was different from the rest of the attic, smoother, newer, and when Liam knocked on it, the sound was hollow. He pulled at the edge, the panel resisted. He pulled harder and a corner gave way, revealing a gap about 18 inches wide. He shone the torch through. Behind the wall was a space roughly 4 feet deep and 8 feet long. A cavity between the false wall and the actual garbled end, and every surface of it, the rafters above, the beams either side, the boards below, was covered. Photographs, hundreds of them, pinned, nailed, and taped to every available surface. Black and white, colour, Polaroids, printed digital images. Some were yellowed with age, some were recent enough that the paper was still white. Every photograph showed the same thing. The house, this house, photographed from outside, at night. Every image showed the front windows, lit from within, and many of them you could make out figures inside, people sitting, standing, moving through rooms, watching television, eating dinner, walking past the window. People who had lived in this house photographed without their knowledge, from the street, from the garden, from angles that meant the photographer had been standing in darkness, pointing a camera at lit windows for what appeared to be years, decades. Liam moved the torch slowly across the display. Nadia gripped the edge of the hatch and tried to make sense of what she was looking at. And then Liam's torch landing on the back wall, the real wall, the brickwork behind the photographs, and he stopped moving entirely, scratched into the bare brick. In rows as neat as a librarian's handwriting were names, first names, dozens of them. Some had dates next to them, some had numbers, heights, weights, some had single words beside them. Monday to Friday, dog walk 7 a.m, returns late. They were organised chronologically, The earliest names were near the top left corner. The most recent cluster was in the bottom right, and at the very end of the list, scratched in letters that were sharper, fresher, less weathered than the rest, was a physical description. Female, early 30s, brown hair, shoulder length, drives a grey Peugeot 208, moved in, followed by a date. It was Nadia's date of purchase, 6 days ago. She hadn't told anyone what car she drove. It wasn't in the estate paperwork, it wasn't visible from inside the house. Someone had seen it. Someone who had been watching the house. Someone who had added her to the wall the same week she moved in. The previous owner had been dead for 7 months. The police removed everything, 231 photographs, 47 names. The false wall panel was taken as evidence. The brick was photographed, catalogued, and filed. Most of the names were untraceable, first names only, no surnames. The photographs had no metadata. The police couldn't determine with certainty who had taken them or when. The previous owner was the most obvious suspect. He lived in the house for over 30 years and had access to the attic, but he'd been dead for 7 months, and Nadia's description was added to the wall less than a week ago. She asked the police directly about this. She said, "He's been dead since March. I moved in 6 days ago. Who wrote my name on that wall?" The officer paused, then he told her something that made her sit down. When the forensic team removed the false wall panel, they examined the inside surface. There were scratches on it, fingernail scratches, from someone gripping the panel from behind and pulling it back into place, pulling it shut from inside the hidden room. The scratches were fresh, the wood splinters were clean, no dust had settled over them. Someone had been inside that room, recently, within the past week, while Nadia was sleeping 1 floor below. The police searched the house. They searched the attic again. They found nothing, no one. The hidden room had no door, no other way in or out except through the attic hatch. Whoever had been in there had come through the same hatch that Nadia walked under every night on the way to bed, had climbed back the same way, and had pulled the false wall shut behind them. The police never made an arrest. The case was filed as an open investigation. It remains open today. Nadia still lives in the house. She told me she can't afford to sell. She would lose money. She replaced the attic hatch with a steel panel bolted from the landing side. She sleeps with a camera pointed at the ceiling. But here's where I need to talk to you directly. Because this isn't just Nadia's story. This is a question, and it applies to everyone listening right now. If you live in a terraced house, a semi-detached house, a flat, a converted building, any home where your living space shares a structure with another, then above your ceiling, right now, there is a space, an attic, a crawl space, a gap between where your life happens and where the roof begins. When was the last time you were up there? When was the last time anyone was up there? Could you say, with certainty, that you know what's up there right now? Every person in these 3 stories would say yes, but every single one of them was wrong. Let me know in the comments below. Do you know what's up there?